Forget to record. Thank you. Thank you. Um, so thank you for that. But again, this training will be recorded so we can always refer back to it or share out with any kind of member of a post-vention committee, member of a community who might benefit from this information. So again, the hub is what is referred to as a regional behavioral health action organization, or RBHAO. DEMIS, or the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, has divided the state up into 5 different regions, largely dependent on population. So the hub is responsible for Region 1, or Southwestern Connecticut. So essentially 14 towns all the way from Stratford down to Greenwich. And we really just serve as a strategic partner in the community. So we aim or hope to be that liaison between the region and the state, but also a support and a resource for you too, across the continuum of prevention, treatment, and recovery for behavioral health. So that includes mental health, substance use, but it also includes suicide prevention and problem gambling. So it's a lot of topics, but I'm sure, as we all know, there is significant overlap with all the topics as well. So that's why we're really here again to be that partner, that community resource to you all. And we are a division of RIASF as well. So to kind of get into it, it is estimated that 115 individuals are exposed to each death by suicide. Some studies found that this number is as high as 135, but 115 is kind of a number that has been settled upon by numerous studies, and that number has been replicated in findings of numerous studies. And I think that's just one important thing to kind of begin with. So we obviously know that any loss of life, any death by suicide is traumatic and is traumatizing to the community as a whole. So I think when we go into these conversations, really understanding that suicide, loss, untimely deaths have a really wide ripple impact on the communities in which that individual is living, working, especially now when we're living in a day and age where, social media is so prominent, that ripple impact of that loss of life can be felt. So, this number is likely higher, but like I mentioned, this is a number that's kind of settled upon by numerous findings. And then of those 115 people, 1 in 5 individuals reported that a suicide death had a devastating impact or caused a major life disruption. So, everybody grieves differently. Everybody is obviously impacted by a death, especially a death by suicide, differently. So obviously people's reactions, people's coping mechanisms vary from person to person. But that exposure, especially that immediate exposure, can really lead to potentially detrimental impacts for somebody's mental health, their overall well-being. So it's really important when we talk about suicide, when we talk about prevention, and when we talk about postvention, we really understand that the way in which a suicide death is dealt with can in turn really work to stabilize, support, and educate those suicide loss survivors. So kind of what is postvention? So I'm using this term, and it was a term that I was not incredibly familiar with until I really got into this line of work. But postvention really refers to the planned response, the planned community response after a suicide or an untimely death. So overall, the intended purpose or goal of postvention is to really help reduce the risk of those suicide loss survivors. And the hope is to prevent further suicide attempts or fatal suicides from taking place. So we do know that for individuals who know someone who has died by suicide or lost their life to suicide, they themselves are actually at heightened risk for a suicide attempt or suicide completion taking place as well. So kind of an underlying theme throughout every slide, the entire kind of presentation or discussion is really going to be focusing on the way that we handle a suicide loss or an untimely death. We talk a lot about our teens, our youth, our young adults, because often these impacts are felt at heightened degrees, but it's really applicable for any individual across the lifespan. So again, having this coordinated, this planned response and approach in dealing with a loss by suicide is really important to ensure the safety of those loss survivors. So these are some kind of core principles that we'll talk about throughout the remainder of the discussion today. But the biggest kind of core principles that have been identified is that suicide is a public health problem. Again, like I mentioned, helping those suicide loss survivors deal and cope with that grief, that loss in an appropriate way. So, really focusing on those coping strategies, on resilience, is important for everybody. Regardless of what kind of impact the suicide may have, really being able to identify resiliency and coping skills is beneficial, regardless of how close the relationship was to this individual who died by suicide. Very similarly, when we take the right actions, we take the right steps after a suicide loss, we can work to hopefully and potentially prevent further suicide attempts or completions actually taking place. And like I just mentioned in the previous slide, we do focus some of these conversations more on our young adults or our youth, but it's all of these slides, all of the information presenting, it's applicable to everybody, regardless of their age. So it's applicable to everybody across the lifespan. Another thing that we'll talk about is that cultural factors, just being overall culturally aware or culturally sensitive, is always really important to consider when we talk about suicide loss, when we talk about untimely deaths. And awareness and communication between individuals, between people within postvention committees or plans will ultimately aid postvention and also prevention efforts. So the impacts of a death by suicide are felt by many, arguably all individuals within the community in which that death takes place. So this slide is more of a visual representation of how the layers of suicide exposure can look like. So we have the suicide bereaved long term, and that's often for people who this kind of grieving period becomes a prolonged struggle that includes diminished functioning, and then it kind of goes up from there. So suicide bereaved short term, suicide affected, and suicide exposed. So again, suicide exposed is kind of a there's more distance in that loss and in that relationship, but everyone who kind of has a connection to the deceased or to the death itself. But also understanding when a death by suicide, a loss by suicide within a community occurs, it really does have varying degrees, but it does have impact on all members of the community. So again, this is more of a visual, but we always need to understand that the way that somebody copes or deals with a death by suicide, regardless of their relationship to that individual, will vary and is a vastly, personal experience. So we're going to just talk a little bit about best practices. And these are always really important to just be mindful of, again, when we're talking about suicide loss, but also untimely death. So I know I'm using the term untimely death as well. And a lot of postvention plans are done so in a broad enough way that they will be applicable for an untimely death, but also a death by suicide. So these best practices are or will be hopefully applicable to both scenarios. So we see this aspect of contagion when we talk about suicide. So a suicide death can affect those beyond the immediate loss survivors and ripple outward, like we've just kind of talked about and seen in those visuals. Although they are rare, we do see suicide clusters or suicide contagions taking place. And that is really just a direct reflection of the fact that exposure to suicide can also increase risk. So teens and young adults are often at a higher risk for contagion, but there's many aspects that go into contagion. So safe reporting is always really important because when that doesn't happen, when that doesn't occur, when we do see this more kind of sensational media reports or media reporting and inappropriate funeral guidelines or funeral events taking place, these aspects can also contribute to contagion. Again, they are relatively rare, but we do always like to talk about them because like we've talked about, like we know, 115 people are exposed per one death by suicide. And then again, those 1 in 4 report those devastating lifelong disruptions or impacts. So we always want to really be mindful of the way that we deal with suicide loss. We talk about suicide loss because it really does have the power to ensure safety of the other remaining community members. So again, we always just kind of talk about language matters, some do's and don'ts. And these are really applicable. Again, these are really focused more in the sense of, a loss by suicide or a death by suicide. But it's really important to always be mindful and cognizant of our language when we talk about mental health, when we talk about substance use disorders, and again, when we talk about suicide. So one of the kind of things that we're always trying to remind people is to shy away or avoid saying phrases like an individual committed suicide. Instead, you can say something like an individual died by suicide, ended his or her their life, or killed themselves. Again, it's really just working more towards person first language to humanizing that experience. And then again, kind of on the same note, we really are working to not say failed or successful attempt. Again, hopefully that's a little bit more self-explanatory. If somebody does lose their life to suicide, it is by no means a success. And if somebody has a non-fatal attempt, that is really by no means a failure. So again, saying phrases such as suicide attempt or death by suicide are often, suggested and better avenues when we're having these conversations and having these dialogues. So again, when we talk about safe messaging, a really large portion of safe messaging is the promotion of resources that are available. So in July of last year, 988 was rolled out. So that is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. And it also has an option specific to veterans. So that is if you press 1. So you can text 988, you can call 988, you can also chat on that web link, 988lifeline.org. Connecticut has mobile crisis, so that's 211. And then there's also the crisis text line, so that's 741-741. We've already kind of talked or touched a little bit upon youth and young adults. I do think that sometimes for our younger individuals, having the option to text a crisis line is a little bit more accessible. So always just being mindful that there are numerous options, numerous avenues of outreach if somebody needs to get connected to crisis services. I also know that sometimes people are hesitant to utilize these numbers. At the hub, we do compile lists of free peer support groups within the region. So that is also an option, but really just being mindful of those call lines, those text lines, those crisis lines, because those are also available 24/7. So again, just knowing what options are there, knowing what you can utilize yourself, knowing what you can disseminate. There really are a lot of options, a lot of resources that are there. Just promoting that somebody is there to help, and you can get connected to services through any one of these numerous avenues. And again, when we talk about messaging, we talk about resources, there are also some kind of general don'ts that we want to work to avoid a little bit more. So again, I hope some of these are a little bit more self-explanatory, but really not sharing or disseminating the details surrounding a suicide death. Not revealing the method, the location, really details that the general public is not necessary for them to be aware of. Again, when we talk about suicide, it's really important to understand that suicide doesn't often occur in a silo. So there are often numerous things going on for that individual, most likely mental health. So we don't want to oversimplify, any suicide incident. But rather we can kind of use this as a way to open the door for conversations surrounding mental health, normalizing those conversations, but also being able to get people connected. Again, not overstating the frequency of suicide, not making the person a saint or celebrity. So it's vitally important that we understand and respect the family's wishes, but also understanding, the community impact that has as well. It's really all ties back to safe messaging. So again, using, proper terminology. So instead of, saying those failed or successful attempts, really just working to normalize that language that we talked about a couple slides back. So also we talk about responsible reporting. And I know that this can get really tricky, especially like I mentioned, when we're really living in a very digital age. So social media is incredibly prevalent and prominent, and it is seen closely in relation to suicide. But it is really important that when we're talking, posting, responding to comments, should a suicide or an untimely death occur, we're doing it in a responsible and safe way. Um, so reporting suicide as a public health issue, but also including stories of hope, including stories of healing, recovery, that can also help reduce that risk of contagion like we talked about. Also including resources. So I know one thing that I always recommend is if you are seeing a post or a comment that is not necessarily safe or responsible reporting, always taking that opportunity to put those resources, put in 988-211 in the comments. You can always report a post as unsafe or inappropriate as well to that platform to, again, try to take that down. Using appropriate language, emphasizing help and hope, but also asking an expert. So really making sure that the information surrounding mental health, the information surrounding resources is accurate. And sometimes that includes bringing in an expert to talk about resources available, to talk about mental health. Again, doing it in a way where timing is appropriate and the needs of the community are really taken into account. And then we kind of get a little bit more into speaking about the death in public. So the way we speak about a suicide, loss, and untimely death is really vitally important. We talk about the topic of person first language, but we also have to understand that when we're talking about suicide, we're talking about real lives that have been lost. So really understanding the humanity of this as well. So first and foremost, and arguably the most important aspect is to respect the family's wishes, respect their right to privacy. Some families choose to not have the manner or cause of death as a suicide revealed. Again, that is completely within their right, within their power, and it is up to us to support that. If that is the case, there's nothing against, again, sharing out those mental health resources, those crisis call or text lines, again, just offering the resources to the community at large, so as to hopefully and potentially reduce that risk of contagion, further suicide attempts taking place. Again, on the kind of flip side, being open about a suicide can also help guide funeral activities. And again, when those funeral activities are done so in a safe, responsible way, that can have a healing aspect to those in attendance, but can also help reduce risk. So the biggest kind of takeaway when we talk about the aftermath of a suicide, how we talk about suicide, those funeral guidelines, we give you these suggestions because they can really help reduce risk when done so in a safe way. So these are kind of examples of ways in which communities have honored or memorialized the loss of an individual by suicide or just an untimely death. So these are just some examples. So flying the flag at half staff, a special plaque or memorial, dedications. So again, all of these kind of honorariums, so to speak, are done so in a very understandable way. And the intent behind these actions is always positive, but we also have to realize the impact they may have on the community, and especially community members who are either at higher risk or who are they themselves struggling with mental health. Again, when we do these kind of honorariums or memorials, what you would do for one, you also have to do for all. So understanding, the town or community capacity to do this for all, and also, again, just really always emphasizing the importance of safe messaging so as to reduce further risk. And that kind of ties into the last point on this slide, which talks about exclusive focus on the deceased positive qualities without looking at what may have contributed to their mental or complex problems can potentially be detrimental. So always just making sure that when we talk about untimely deaths or suicide losses, we do so in a lens of mental health promotion, mental health awareness, because often suicide attempts, suicide completions, and mental health are really closely intertwined. So we always want to make sure that those conversations are happening in tandem. So these are just some more general suggested funeral guidelines. And again, like I mentioned at the very beginning, I know a lot of you, many of you on this call are really closely doing this work. So I do know that this is a refresher, but it's always just kind of important to familiarize ourselves with these findings. So again, always encouraging coordination between family, funeral, faith leaders, but also mental health providers and other people within the community who can offer that additional support. This is really critical, and it also plays, a role in the safety of those lost survivors. So for funerals, we always recommend that those additional mental health providers supports are there, because everybody to varying degrees has some kind of connection to a suicide loss or a suicide attempt, and that can be really triggering to those in attendance. So always making sure that if that is the case, that those protective factors, those supports are already in place. Again, always encouraging the use of safe messaging and public discussion about the death. So I know we've already really touched upon this a lot, talked about this a lot, but the funeral itself is a really prime and important time to utilize safe messaging and healthy, correct messaging about mental health and about suicide if that comes up in conversation. And then again, keeping public displays of notes and remembrances time limited. So again, it's very similar to those kind of memorials, honorariums that we talked about in the previous slide. People do this with the best of intentions, and it's very understandable. But we always want to remember that it's important to keep them time limited, so as to promote positive healing and resiliency. These are just some further funeral guidelines. So again, holding the service at a time and a place where adults, caregivers, parents can accompany their youth or accompany youth. So again, like we already talked about, these funerals, these memorials can be really triggering, traumatizing, just bring up and evoke a lot of emotions in our youth and also our adults. So always making sure that those supports for one another, those overall kind of more general community supports are in place, and they're made accessible. Providing counselors during and after the service to encourage help seeking. So we always want to really encourage the continuation of dissemination and sharing out of resources. I think especially within our region, but also across the state, there are so many resources that go far beyond 988-211-741-741. I know we've already included those in a previous slide, and they are widely beneficial and useful, but there are also so many other avenues and options for support and help seeking. Immediately after the loss, especially at these funerals or these remembrances, these are times where emotions are heightened. So making sure that those resources are available on site, but also making sure that they are available following in the days, weeks, months after that loss. Very similarly, just providing information about suicide prevention, about additional mental health services, just so people are aware of what the options are and that there are many different avenues in terms of seeking help and seeking support for mental health. And then we kind of get into electronic media. So we already kind of touched upon this numerous times, but most major media outlets have websites, and the trend is for there to be less editorial oversight. I've seen in my line of work, even through Instagram, that comment sections especially can frequently obtain inappropriate, inaccurate comments that can potentially be harmful, triggering, again, just disseminate inaccurate information. So there's a lot of ways that you yourself can try to work to combat this. I know I already mentioned, but putting 741 or 988 in the chat with a little blurb about what it is, why, and how you can utilize it, reporting these posts or these comments to the social media platforms. Again, it's tricky because there is less oversight, but there are ways that we can, again, promote that more positive help-seeking trend. Again, social networking sites serve as a connected community, and there are a lot of benefits to that, but there are also a lot of downfalls. So at the very beginning, when we talk about those 115 individuals who are impacted by a suicide loss, I would argue that that number is a lot higher just from the exposure to suicide through social networking and through social media. So search for information related to the death and monitor postings for warning signs. Sites, again, like I mentioned, can also be deactivated. You can report them or placed on memorial status when requested by next of kin. So there are a lot of ways that social media is wonderful, especially I know it can help in sharing out these resources, but we also want to make sure that the opposite effect doesn't happen, so that misinformation, inappropriate information is not promoted or shared. And then we also see community forums as a resource. So they have been cited as a resource for healings in communities that have experienced a suicide loss. But that being said, the agenda should really focus on healing, prevention, and reducing risk alone. So it is a space for people to share their thoughts, their feelings, and they can work together to identify, strengthen, those positive and protective factors, while also hoping to reduce those risk factors. So again, some of those protective factors are really that community connection, that community outreach, and that collaboration among sectors. But it's also really highly recommend, strongly encouraged to closely monitor these forums, these discussions, so as to avoid re-traumatization, any triggering content. And again, just that's all done through really avoiding specific examples, specific details surrounding the loss. And then if a forum is utilized, it's important to understand or it's important that those attending, monitoring the discussion are understanding and sensitive to those that are participating. Like we mentioned, it's really not a place for specifics to be discussed, but rather to come together to work, focus on resiliency, on healing, prevention, and how the community can work together to reduce further attempts, reduce that risk of contagion. So like I kind of touched upon very briefly towards the beginning, postvention quickly and easily becomes prevention. Like we talked about, like we discussed, those suicide loss survivors are at higher risk themselves. So therefore, the way that a community responds to a suicide loss can become prevention in and of itself. So these are kind of some public health intervention strategies for a postvention response. So we have the indicated level, which targets family and close friends of the individual who lost their life to suicide. Then we get into a little larger of a scale, which is selective. So it is directed towards the school or the community impacted. And then we get into universal, which focuses on a larger scale kind of media coverage after a high profile death, untimely death, lost by suicide. Like we talked about, all community members, or the vast majority of community members, are impacted by a suicide loss and can deal with the loss in varying ways. So, like I already kind of touched upon, just because an individual is not a close friend or family member of the deceased, that does not mean that they are impacted any less. So understanding that and having these kind of different approaches, different responses, different strategies, so to make sure that that contagion aspect is reduced to the best of our abilities. And then we get into a little bit more of postvention protocol, postvention planning. So these are important to make note of when you begin to activate or you are in a state where you are activating your postvention protocols. So the first 72 hours after a death by suicide are understandably the most chaotic and stressful for all individuals involved. Therefore, a postvention response is needed, um, really to offer clarity, hopefully diffuse any other situations, and offer stability to those in need or at heightened risk during this time. Again, emotional turmoil and confusion can impair decision making. So, postvention protocols, procedures are helpful, especially when pre planned or predetermined, because again, they offer that clarity to those who may have that impaired decision making. Having proactive protocols grounds everyone, so everyone knows what their role in the postvention protocol committee is, what is expected of them, and how they can execute those duties. And again, best practice standards for communication and funeral activities also clarify the actions that need to be taken following a suicide death. But the biggest kind of takeaway when we talk about postvention planning, postvention protocols, is that it's really best to have these plans, have these committees in place prior to a suicide death even taking place. So obviously, we never necessarily know when a suicide attempt or death will take place, but having these plans in place prior, so everybody again knows those expectations, knows what will unfold within the community following a death by suicide or an untimely death. Again, I know I've already said it, but it really can work to ensure the safety of those community members. So these are just some kind of guidelines or suggestions for what postvention protocols should entail. Um, so again, some of the most important things are that a postvention protocol is able to quickly mobilize and organize resources. Um, so it provides both immediate, so again, within that 72-hour window, and long-term plans. Um, so again, like we already kind of talked about, it's important for these resources, these call lines, text lines, to be shared on a regular basis at all times, regardless of if a loss or a death has taken place in recent history. But it's really important, again, in those 72 hours or immediately following this loss. And then again, on those longer term scenarios as well. So anniversaries, graduations, anything that can kind of stir up or trigger these emotions or these memories. Setting up communication channels with relevant community services and agencies. And again, making sure that these communications within these agencies or these services are always open. These lines of communication are always open. Securing community safety, that will obviously look very different within each town, within each community, will vary depending on the situation. Um, but it's really important, again, that this is done through utilization of safe messaging and best practices. And establishing clear procedures, which include a broad base of community representatives and being able to delegate responsibilities. So being able to really offer clarity for next steps. And again, when we kind of have these postvention protocols set in place in a more proactive manner, we can make sure that each individual on a postvention committee, so to speak, knows exactly what their responsibility is, what exactly their role is within that committee, and how, again, to execute that. So what that really entails in terms of tasks, next steps, what's needed from them. So like I've mentioned, I've been using the terms suicide, loss, and untimely death very interchangeably. So postvention protocols should also be flexible in order to accommodate different situations, different circumstances. And we always recommend for them to be sustainable. So be tied to a position or a role rather than a specific person. Um, Again, that really just ensures sustainability and capacity. We always want our postvention protocols, plans, our committee members to be free of bias. and also considering ethnic, racial, cultural, spiritual, sexual orientation, identity, and other aspects within each unique and individual community. Also, something that goes really hand in hand with being free of bias is understanding that these postvention protocols, these plans can change and flux over time. So again, being flexible, not being rigid, but also understanding that they may evolve or change over time, really to best support the community members. Postvention protocols should also be able to address the complex mental health issues for individuals and groups that may arise after a suicide. So again, always having those additional supports, issues, being able to address them. And then again, like we've talked about numerous times already, but that safe messaging. So avoiding language and being understandable to the diversity within the community, but also being able to include the professionals who are involved in postvention. So, we've already talked about the importance of mental health conversations and how, when a death by suicide occurs in the community, we always want to be able to bring in those mental health resources and have these conversations surrounding mental health. But being able to have these dialogues sometimes in a less structured way. So we talked about those community forums, but really being able to break down, again, the stigma, but also some of the terminology when we talk about mental health, really, so we're able to do so in an understandable way. And these are just some, recommendations for when you're actually in a position where you're forming a postvention committee. I know, again, some of you on this call are already leads on a postvention committee or team or involved in a postvention committee or team, but this information is really just helpful in that it allows for stakeholders to be identified as critical parts of the postvention committee. So again, on the right side, we just have some examples of who we suggest or who should really be on or involved in the committee. So there's often a lead contact for the postvention committee, and that is traditionally the lead for human services within the town. Always incorporating some individuals or the lead from the local prevention council within that town, a superintendent of schools or a school representative, a health department director, a town chief of police, a town first select person, and if you have the capacity, if people are willing, some other members to include maybe faith leaders, social service coordinators, local resources, local providers. Again, it's important to establish a well-rounded team who can deploy postvention plans in the event of a suicide and untimely death taking place. Again, these are all really important people to kind of bring to the table, because you also do have different roles, and that is done intentionally. We want to intentionally include these people so we get different perspectives when we have these conversations. Another thing that we always like to talk about when we talk about, identifying people to be on these teams or these committees, is the approach that we take. So I know a lot of schools already kind of have their set of procedures and protocols should a student, teacher, faculty member, have an untimely death or a death by suicide. So again, being able to approach schools, have them be part of this team or this committee, and doing so in a collaborative way. So again, these people are all identified because they are a support to the town, but the members of each team and each committee are also there to support one another. And everybody on these committees involved in these plans have the same common goal, and that's again to reduce contagion, reduce risk, hopefully and potentially prevent further suicide attempts from taking place. And then we just have some more kind of general tasks of the committee, of those individuals who have been identified as stakeholders, and who will kind of be carrying out this work. So again, you will receive information about the suicide death from first responders, that postvention lead, that identified person, is responsible for coordinating response steps. So again, in towns, in places where that postvention plan has already been determined, this really looks like the postvention lead reaching out to those other stakeholders, and then everybody kind of goes forward with their respective tasks or duties. So again, that can look like connecting with law survivors and witnesses, to witnesses, and with services, with resources, with supports, offering resources to the news, interfacing with the news or other media outlets, issue statements as needed, advising others who are issuing public statements, being able to be identified as a go-to resource for information about suicide support and prevention. So again, I know I've said this numerous times already, but it's really important that these plans are done far before a suicide attempt or completion, a death by suicide occurs in the community. And this is really more so for you all as well. If you are in the position where you are part of a postvention team or committee, if this information is already compiled, if everybody knows their roles and responsibilities, through activation, it's really just far more of a seamless approach and dissemination of resources, information, and duties. We always, again, recommend that a kind of daily debrief among those individuals on the postvention team happens. Again, this is to share information, share if anything else has come out or emerged, but also to collaborate and for self-care as well. So being able to really be there for one another as a source of support. It's also really important for the postvention team or committee members to be able to monitor contagion risk and be able to identify when a broader response needs to be activated. So that could look like, getting in touch with postvention committee members from neighboring towns or communities, again, so a broader response, more resources, more support is available to those who are in the most critical need at that time. We also want to coordinate with the Suicide Prevention Coalition and other key community members who can monitor, again, whether a community-wide or a larger response is needed. Over time, it's important to gather, present information about the implementation of the postvention plan. And this is really just so any changes, recommendations, modifications to that plan can be made. So again, like we've talked about, those first 72 hours in the event that a postvention plan does need to be activated, it's a stressful, it's a chaotic time for the law survivors, but also for the people activating this postvention response. So there are a few times that it goes off seamlessly, but being able again to kind of regroup, debrief, identify ways in which this plan or this activation can be bettered, can be improved. So again, if you are in the event where this has to occur again, those committee members feel prepared to do so. So it's also important to establish, confirm, and document facts and circumstances. So the first responders often notify the postvention lead, providing very basic information. The postvention lead will receive identity, circumstances, witnesses, and contact information. If that individual is not contacted by law enforcement, it is imperative that the team confirm and validate that information first and foremost. The postvention lead will then again kind of activate that postvention plan by contacting other team or committee members and coordinating response. Like we talked about, the postvention committee will hold daily debrief meetings, and during these kind of meetings, next steps, assignments, tasks, and support will be discussed. So next steps. So we've kind of talked about, what postvention is, why it's important, how and why it ensures community safety, and reduces the risk of contagion. So again, now what do we do? So the biggest thing to do is to outline specific actions to be implemented in response to a suicide loss. Again, clearly designating specific individuals and, and alternates to respond to key components to the postvention plan. It is important to make sure that that contact list is updated regularly. So again, if somebody in a position moves roles, that that new individual is identified and that this, the contact is regularly updated. Identify prearranged contacts, referral resources, procedures with local crisis service personnel, police, and emergency medical service providers so that these necessary services are readily accessible when a loss does occur. So again, a lot of this work is proactive. So is done before a suicide attempt or a death by suicide actually occurs within the community. And we always really want to encourage this. We have seen that in these kind of activations of procedures that are reactive as opposed to proactive, it can get really hectic really fast. But when we have these plans already established, already in place, these contacts, these connections are already identified, it's a far more seamless activation. Again, being able to have this document, have this plan to reference back to. So having documentation of these procedures, of these forms, who exactly is that contact for each role and responsibility, and sharing this documentation out to whoever it is fitting to share it with. And debrief steps for college personnel or personnel after a loss has happened. So kind of just some summarizing words. We've talked a lot about relationships, about connections, really just being able to reiterate that having people feeling connected to their community, supported by their community is really important. The devil is in the details. So this one's a little funnier, but it's really important that everybody understands their role and their responsibility. And that is done when there is a detailed plan and approach for postvention activation already in place. Again, you must know what is available in order to offer it. So I know that's kind of where you can turn to us at the Hub. So we are always in a state of updating our resource guides, updating our lists of providers, of free peer support groups, but really knowing what available resources are out there, whether it's in your town, in your community, in your region, again, virtual or telehealth services across the state, really knowing what is an option in order to offer it or disseminate it to those in need. Effective supports and services must be mobilized, not simply available upon request. Families come first. So again, always really understanding, respecting, and prioritizing the needs of the family of those lost survivors. Again, the community at large, but really making sure that the family and the loved ones are the most important in that moment. And then again, start wherever you are and don't be afraid to persevere. So again, I know that the topic of suicide loss, the topic of postvention activation, community response to suicide loss seems like a really big conversation and a massive undertaking, especially when we know that the way that we respond to a suicide loss can really have massive impacts on those community members. But the biggest thing to kind of make note of or to walk away understanding is that proper proactive postvention plans are really vastly helpful. So again, not being afraid to persevere, and leaning on us at the Hub, leaning on your other towns with those established postvention plans, really having a community approach, but not being afraid to persevere or to take the lead and to start this work. So this again was kind of offered in more of a part 2 or 2-part series. So the first part of Postvention 101 was really just to give a more general overview of what postvention is, why it's important again, what some of those steps, those procedures, those protocols look like or entail. The second session, or the second part, so to speak, is a town-specific planning meeting. So for those interested, I am going to give you a little homework. But for the towns without current or active postvention plans or committees, the towns with active vention or active postvention plans or committees, but want a refresher, want to go over their plans again, you can email me and we will again schedule that second session. So the goal of the part 2 is to really get those town stakeholders together in a meeting. And again, I will be there. And then we can kind of walk through what steps need to be taken, how to establish that plan if one is not already in place, and who will be responsible for each step. And again, what those kind of smaller under like tasks will look like and will be, and how to again execute those. So it's really just hopefully a space and a time for you as town identified stakeholders for the postvention team to kind of get together and really solidify a postvention plan, a postvention response, and understand kind of at the end of that session what exactly those next steps are, or when activation occurs, what that will look like. So I do want to say thank you, but before I let you all go, I do have a lot of references or resources. A lot of these are included or available on our website, but I will be including them in a follow-up email as well. There's a lot of information surrounding postvention, why it's important. Again, some of these resources are more specific to schools or educators, those working with youth, but they're all really wonderful in that they talk a lot about the importance of postvention and how postvention really quickly becomes or turns into prevention. I do see a hand, if you want to, Lena.
Yes, thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much for the beautiful, very interesting, presentation. I love. Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah,
Okay,
sorry, I
yes.
just stopped sharing my screen so I could see everybody.
Yes. Yes. I have a question. Are we going to have the copy of these presentation slides?
I can definitely share them. If there's specific information that you want more on or specific slides, I can also share that with you as well.
Perfect. And then, I live in New Haven. Is that okay for me to do the homework, or it has to be only?
So I can send you a contact for the individual in New Haven who can walk you through. So she has my exact role, title. She's very knowledgeable about postvention, but because the hub is only for region 1, so again from Stratford to Greenwich, I'll
Sure.
just refer you to her, but I'll put you in touch with her for sure.
Yes, thank you so much.
Of course, thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you. And I do see in the chat, thank you, Dawn, the Alternatives to Suicide support groups. Amazing resource within the region in Westport. So thank you for putting that in the chat. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but you feel free to go if anybody wants to sit back, have any questions, any lingering comments that they want to share. Otherwise, I will put my email in the chat for those of you who want to do the second part, but I will be sharing a follow-up email again with those resources following today's presentation. So thank you all so much.